Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Thursday, January the 9th. And tonight we're going to have the great pleasure and treat of bringing back our good friend, Professor Carlos Eire, great friend of our video and podcast over the years, and of course, a contributor to Babalu, where many of you follow. So, Carlos, let me give you a wonderful Babalu abrazo here to you.
Same back to you. Yes.
All right. Very good. For those who may not be familiar with your story, you were one of the 14,000 Pedro Pan children who came to the United States, and then you wrote a story about it. You put it in a book format called "Waiting for Snow in Havana." And I believe, Carlos, that you may have been the first of our generation, the first Cuban American who wrote a book like that. And of course, others got inspired, myself included. But since you wrote that book, a lot of other Cubans have decided to put their stories, and I'm so happy that they've done that.
Oh, yeah.
Because these are great stories that we all have to tell.
I'm thrilled. You know, I just watched a talk I gave in 2011 in Miami at the Pedro Pan annual reunion, in which I encouraged everyone in the room to write their stories down. Yeah. And even more, I forgot I had said this. I said, get your parents to write their story, because the parents were like World War II veterans. They were all kind of starting to die. That generation was starting to pass away. So I said, you get your parents to write the story, which is a totally untold story of what the hard decision the parents had to make.
Well, that whole story of the Cubans, our parents who left. Now, in my case, I left with both of my parents, not like your situation. But I always felt that these parents kind of kept a lot of it inside. And because I know many times I would speak with my mother and my father, who have since passed away here in the last couple of years, but I would always try to get information from them. And it seems like when they came here, this is my analysis, they came here and they were hurting so much from having to leave Cuba. I mean, they never really wanted to leave Cuba. It was a decision they made for their children. That's what my parents would always tell me, and I would hear that from other parents as well. And they were hurting. So they all kind of got to work. They kind of focused on working, focused on raising their kids, opening businesses or whatever they did. And then 30, 40 years goes by, and now they're retired.
Yeah.
And we used to tell my parents, I would always get so much information from my father about Cuba. And I used to see him every Sunday. Every Sunday we go to their house, eat my mother's food, and say hello to my parents. And I would always talk to my father. And I always encouraged my three sons to talk to them as well, and said, hey, get information from your abuelos. They have a lot of information. They have a lot of stories. So I think you're right. I think that whole generation should write more and tell us more about their story.
Yeah.
Like the whole story of Cuba and especially January 1959, which is, I think, such an important month.
Yeah.
For all of us.
Unfortunately, there are so few of them left. Now, where the viejos or viejucos?
That's right. Los viejos. Right? I used to love that. I don't know if you remember this, but my maybe they did it in your family too, but my father and my uncles would call my abuelo el viejo.
That's right. Yeah.
That was the way. That's the way they talk about my grandfather, el viejo. El viejo y la vieja, the abuela.
Yeah.
And that's how they would talk about them.
And you know what? The teenagers in Chicago, the Cuban teenagers in Chicago, would call their parents el viejo y la vieja. Okay. Their parents, not their grandparents.
Right. Yeah. No, but you're so right about that. That generation, I mean, I know in my case, I've lost both of them. I've lost not only my two parents, but my two uncles who came here too with them, my aunt, my mother's side, who came later. So, I mean, they're all gone. So now it's up to us to tell the story. But Carlos, 1959, that's what, 66 years ago? Yes. That it just seems hard to believe that this regime would last for 66 years, but there they are. Somehow they last.
It's lasted longer than the Cuban Republic did. Mm-hmm. Cuban Republic lasted from 1902 to 1958. It died abruptly on New Year's Day, 1959. So 1959 to 1902, 57 years. Now these pirates, as I call them, they've been in control for 66 years. They're pirates that hijacked the island.
Right. I always get this question, and maybe you get it too, or you've gotten this question over the years. A lot of people will say to me, Cuba was doing so well. How did you have a revolution? Or they always say, why did you have a revolution? And I always say to them, but we never really had a revolution. What we had was, there was a vacuum, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a vacuum that Fidel Castro filled.
Yes.
But it wasn't like, there was this great yearning for Castro.
No.
There was more of a yearning maybe to get rid of Batista. That maybe there was.
Yes.
So
it was a corrupt dictatorship, and it was very cruel to anyone who opposed it, but nothing like the cruelty that followed. And what I tell people is that Fidel Castro's revolution, the July 26th movement, was only one of over a dozen opposition groups that fought against Batista. And most of the other groups, if not all of them, were democratic in their outlook and in their purpose. And the ones who bore the brunt of the fighting against the Batista regime were not Fidel's olive green dressed rebels. No, it was the urban resistance groups, especially the university students. They're the ones who attacked the presidential palace and almost killed Batista.
That would be Jose Antonio Echeverria, right? That would be him.
And these were the university students who were, and there's a wonderful book that was self-published, so therefore not too many people know about it, written by, I forget his first name, but Marcus Sterling.
Yes.
Who wrote this book? The title is Cuba 1959 or something. And actually I think it was his father, the author's father, was going to run against someone else in the 1959 election.
I think this gentleman came to the Sterling that you're talking about, came to the United States. And I know that his daughter is on Facebook, because I see some postings that she does, and she has made reference to her father. That's the connection that
It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
Because it has so many details about what could have been, and how quickly and how brutally and stupidly one man and his group sidelined everybody else.
Something else too. One of my favorite parts of your book, because I remember talking to my father about it, and it's one of my favorite parts is when December 31st, you go to a wedding, right? You and your family go to a wedding, and then you're driving home. And I think your mother said that the streets were empty, that she says, that there wasn't anything going on, which I think surprised your mother probably.
Yes, she was scared, actually, I think.
Yeah. And I don't remember that night. I slept through that night. I woke up the next morning, and I did the next morning. I do remember my father on the phone and my mother watching TV and making some pan con leche for all of us to have. But I don't remember the night. But my parents remember it quite well, because they didn't go out that night. Not because they were afraid. They just didn't go out that night. And so they heard about it because a neighbor across the street calls them and said, "Hey, did you hear that Batista fled?" And so that's how my father found out about it, like at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, it didn't happen like the Godfather movie, as I always tell my friends. If you want Cuban history, don't watch that movie. It's a good movie, but not about Cuban history. But that's how my father found out about it. And it must have been at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when he got the phone call from the neighbor across the street, who apparently got the news from somebody else. So anyway, but what a morning! And who in that generation would have expected this to last 66 years? I mean, it's beyond explanation.
Well, that's what before I left in 1962. My parents were sending us to the U.S. My dad kept saying, "Oh, well, we'll see you soon. This won't last more than a couple more months."
Yeah.
And then here we are.
Well, remember the bottle of wine that we all had? At least our family had a bottle of wine that we were going to open
in Havana.
In Havana, in Cuba, and that didn't materialize. But it's interesting because this recent collapse of the power grid, it's just, I mean, to me, if that isn't the evidence of a failed state, I don't know what is.
Yes.
But I was talking to a lady who recently left Cuba, and she was saying that this is such a horrible case of mismanagement, almost like the situation in LA right now with these fires. They just didn't update the power grid. It was simply a case of mismanagement. They just didn't do it. And they didn't do it because they don't have to worry about it. Their lights never go out. I mean, they don't have to worry about the lights going out at the homes of the top generals and so on. They've got their own lights going on.
It's been like that for a while. My uncle, who remained in Cuba, the building in which he lived was on the same grid as the Communist Party hospital in Havana. And everybody else who suffered blackouts, he was never affected. So they've done that with everything, the sugar production, the rice production, you name it. The infrastructure, the water supply.
Oh yes.
Everything is at least at minimum 66 years old.
Right.
They haven't put anything new in.
Well, but the story of Cuba having to import sugar, that may even be more dramatic than the power grid. I mean, the idea that Cuba, I mean, I have some friends of mine at the church. We usually go out to lunch after Mass on Sundays. And they were asking me a very simple and honest question. And they said, how is it possible that Cuba is importing sugar? And I said, well, socialism, that's what happens. Now you have a couple of stories today in Babalu that I just wanted to get your reaction to. The first one is about the dollar-only stores. Now, I always thought they had those stores. Are you saying these are new ones that they're putting in?
They're building. They have opened several much larger stores now. This brand new one, which is it's in my neighborhood, only a few blocks from the house where I used to live. So I know exactly where it is. And it's part of a hotel chain. It's actually the building itself is part of a hotel complex. And the article today was about a YouTuber who went in there and checked it out just like less than a week after opening. Some of the shelves are empty already. And what they did is they raided the stores that normal Cubans shop in, and they filled their shelves with those products to sell them at like double or triple or quadruple the price. And then all of these Cubans who receive remittances from their relatives in exile or diaspora, they went in and cleaned out the shelves. And now the store is, it's there. People go there, they buy stuff, but it's super expensive. And you can't use Cuban currency.
So the only, now how do the Cubans who get remittances How do they get the dollars? Through debit cards or actual cash?
I don't know, actually. I don't know.
I've always wondered about that. Maybe somebody at Babalu who's written about this can fill me in. But because the money is generally transferred bank to bank now with the sophisticated. I mean, the days of cash are pretty much gone, even in Mexico with their remittances.
Right.
So you probably go bank to bank, which means that they never probably have the cash.
Well,
They have maybe a debit card that they use.
yeah,
I'm thinking.
I think
I'm
it's
just
all.
speculating.
I think it's all electronic.
It's got to be, yeah.
Because there actually isn't enough. They don't have enough paper
Right.
to print Cuban currency. So I doubt very much that there's enough dollar or euro currency actually floating around in Havana or any other part of Cuba.
Right. And if there is Cuban paper floating around, nobody probably wants it.
They won't take it at the store.
They won't take it. They won't take it. Which reminds me of a story. Maybe I think this happened after you left. I remember all of a sudden one day, this is 60 or 61. So maybe you were gone already.
No, I left 62.
Okay. Then do you remember the day that you had to go in and exchange your pesos?
Oh, yeah. Oh, man.
Remember that day?
That day has made me poor in this country because I lost all confidence in monetary systems.
Okay.
And therefore, I have never invested my money in anything.
I'll never forget that morning. My father took a bunch of bills, and I said to him, "Where are you going? Entonces dinero, ¿dónde vas?" Efectivo. I love that word, efectivo. Yeah. I love that word. That is the greatest word for cash in any language, efectivo. Oh. So my father said, "Well, I'm going down to, I guess, wherever he was going to, and you turned in 1 peso, and they gave you a new peso."
Right.
And I'll never forget that. I mean, the lines and
yes,
and like you said, people cannot believe stuff like that used to happen.
No. But it was even worse. It was worse than that because there was a cap placed on how much money you could convert into efectivo. There was, and that was Che Guevara's plan to make everybody equal. They actually, the other part of the really nasty part of that day was that they seized all bank accounts on the island.
Right.
And no one could have more than 300 pesos. I remember the figure, 300 pesos. No one was to have more than that. So if you had, let's say, anything over 300 pesos in your account, it was taken by the government.
Wow. That part I didn't know, but I love that word, efectivo.
Efectivo.
I just love that word. My father would always say, "¿Cuánto efectivo tienes?" And I never, and then he would say cash. I said, "Oh, cash is efectivo?" I said, "No, it's not efectivo, but that's the word we use at the bank." So I just thought that was a great word.
What a day that was. It was a Sunday.
My goodness. My goodness, what a day it was. Now, the other story that you wrote, and I think this is an ongoing story. You wrote something about the U.S. Court of Appeals denying a Cuban-American family a case against Castro Inc. regarding properties stolen in Cuba. And right now, it lost an appeal. I would like to see go to the Supreme Court because this is a classic case of property rights. And it could really set a standard for the United States and property rights. So I don't think this case is over yet, but it's over for now. But there's going to be, I'm sure, an appeal to the Supreme Court.
Well, this has been going on for several years. I think it began in maybe even before COVID.
Well, the article said that Trump began to enforce.
That's right.
Helms-Burton because it was not enforced under President Obama. It existed, but it wasn't enforced. So that I think maybe 2019 is the date that the article cites. Yeah.
And the is not against the Castro monopoly. It's against 2 French banks that were financing these cruise lines. So it's actually, these banks and the cruise lines involved, which were using the docks in Havana that were once owned by this family, for which they were never compensated. They have put on a full court press, no pun intended, and spent lots and lots, tons of money to make sure that the lawsuit doesn't make it.
Okay.
So it's big money versus this family, which obviously is not in the same ballpark with the cruise lines and these two French banks when it comes to spending money for lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know who these American judges are, but from what I read today, and I'm no legal expert, it's all the appeal was rejected on the tiniest little technicalities about the Helms-Burton law. Yeah.
Well, that's what I read in the article you cited, that they, on one hand, they're saying the appeal, it does fall under Helms-Burton, but then on the other hand, this particular case doesn't, or
Right.
something like that is how I understood. And hopefully it'll go to the, sometimes when you lose on appeal, you actually win because it takes you to the next level. Yeah. And hopefully that's what happens here at the Supreme Court. Well, tomorrow, January the 10th, is a big day in Venezuela with supposedly talking about inaugurations, Maduro. And they're expecting a lot of problems down there tomorrow, Friday. We hope, there aren't any casualties, but I fear that they probably will be. Well, but, yeah, go ahead.
Canada, I think today or yesterday, recognized the legitimate winner of the election.
Okay, Gonzalez.
Edmundo
Gonzalez, right?
Edmundo Gonzalez. And other countries have done so, but it seems to me this is a done deal. Maduro, or Podrido, as I like to call him,
right,
is going to be inaugurated, and nothing will change.
But that brings me to the next point I wanted to ask you, because with the incoming Trump administration, and especially Secretary Rubio, I am optimistic that they will put enough pressure on Maduro to let him know that maybe that it would be better for him to spend the rest of his life in Panama in exile than in Guantanamo, because I could see the Trump administration going after Maduro over drugs.
Oh,
and just like they went after Noriega, I could see that.
And Trump, winning this election seems to have supercharged him. And he's not only talking about reclaiming the Panama Canal, buying Greenland, annexing Canada. You've got to know, everybody knows that he's not going to stop there,
right?
Unless this is all, I don't think that he's bluffing. I think he's serious. I think he's very serious.
And Carlos, the other thing too, that when I hear Trump talking about Panama and Greenland, I think the bid over Canada is just because he doesn't like Trudeau. Yeah. And frankly, I don't like Trudeau either. And to be honest with you, Trudeau took shots at Trump before. So it's not, I think Trump is kind of getting even with him. Right. This is kind of a personal thing between them. But the point that I think Trump is trying to make is China. Because the real problem here is not Panama or Greenland. The problem is China. China is building a port in Peru, which would give the Chinese Navy a place to stop in South America in a very key position there in Peru. China is now in the Panama Canal. So I think Trump is really talking about China. Everybody gets all bent out of shape about the way he says things, and I understand that. But he's really talking about China, Carlos. That's what I'm hearing, especially with Greenland, because of all the resources they have up there.
Yeah, well, China is the looming threat. China also, for years now, has been planning to build a canal through Nicaragua. Right. And China, I on Babalu, I've posted many times. China completely refurbished the harbor in Santiago de Cuba.
Really? I didn't know that. What? Oh,
Oh,
no, wait a minute. You posted that. You're right.
I've
You're right. Yeah.
posted
Yeah.
several
Yeah.
times, and
Yeah.
nobody's paying it. Nobody seems to be paying any attention to the fact that this was ostensibly or supposedly to make it able to take cargo ships with container cargo ships, but it also made that port open to warships, Chinese warships.
Right.
And Santiago is only it's not very far from Guantanamo, from the Guantanamo naval base.
And
So,
that's a naturally great port, isn't it?
yeah.
I mean, Santiago is a naturally very good port.
As with the sugar and the electric power plants and everything, it had gone to pot.
Right.
And the Chinese came in and refurbished it. They deepened the harbor, is what they did, so that huge ships could now come in.
Now, China also, I read, maybe in one of your posts, that China had told the Cuban government that they have to reform economically, which I thought was kind of funny.
Yeah.
But it has to do, I suppose, with the fact that maybe China wants Cuba to be more like China. Do you think that's it?
Yeah. Yeah. They want this, they want this, I wouldn't call it semi-communism, because it's not even semi, it's not even half communism. It's cronyism within a system in which the government, of course, controls everything, including private business.
Right.
And that's what they want. They know this is what they've done in China. They've turned it into a powerhouse for manufacturing and other kinds, and every kind of business. And they want Cuba to do the same. They're not going to invest in Cuba if, in fact, there's nothing going on.
Right. And they're even talking about building electric vehicles in Mexico, which is why there's so much concern about the free trade agreement, because even the Canadians are angry about that. But one final thought here, Carlos. We got to do this more often. I enjoy it so much. But one final thought here, and I remember asking my father about this one time, my late father. I would say, Papi, how is it possible that this island where we were born, it has been so consequential in the sense of a military location, strategic location? Now the Chinese are interested in building ports, the Soviets before, the United States before. I mean, it is really remarkable how this little island has such a strategic location. Then my father said to me something. He said, somebody in Spain one time said that whoever had Cuba had the keys to the Americas or something like that, that somebody said. But aren't you surprised sometimes how strategic and how important Cuba is for so many superpowers, Carlos?
Well, it is for especially for navies, for naval stuff. It is very strategically located, and it is the largest of all the Caribbean islands. If you squish it all together, it's the same size as Pennsylvania.
Right.
But it's the fact that it stretches for 800 miles, right? And the U.S., from the beginning of the 19th century on, the entire 19th century, there were elements in the U.S. who wanted to annex Cuba, especially the Confederates, the southern states that had slavery that became the Confederacy. They saw in it just an extension of the southern slave plantation economy. And there was so many attempts to annex it. I have not done enough digging to figure out why the U.S. let it go in 1902, but it did, and it boggles the mind just to think of the possibilities of what Cuba would have been like, I mean, it could have gone either way. If it had been a copy of, let's say, Puerto Rico under total U.S. control. But the thing is, Cuba had too many, already has larger, the sugar business in Cuba, that industry was incredible in terms of the wealth it generated. So Cuba had a substantial number of criollos, people born in the island, as well as recent immigrants who were opposed to being a colony of the United States.
But that's what my father always said when I asked him that question. My father would always say that Cubans wanted to be an independent country. That's where the mindset of Cuba was. And then, of course, it was very much related to the United States, I think in a more positive way than negative way.
Oh,
yeah. I think that Cuba benefited a great deal from that relationship, including, I remember you writing this article years ago about the number of immigrants who came to Cuba. They came to Cuba because it was so stable, because they assumed it was not part of the United States legally, but close enough to the United States where there would never be any political upheaval. And then, of course, the United States then, they guaranteed the sugar price, which I think was a huge factor in developing the Cuban economy, Carlos.
Oh, yes. Yep. And during World War I, that's when it really took off like a rocket. Because to get sugar in Europe, where are they going to get the sugar? Sure. They relied a lot on beet sugar before that, but the First World War made Cuban sugar prices go up and up and up and up. And that's called, I think, La Danza de los Millones.
I think so. I think you're right. I think you're right. Now, and another thing too, one last thing I wanted to say about los centrales, as they were called, the sugar mills, los centrales. One of the great things about them was how much of an impact they had in the development of Cuban railroads and Cuban infrastructure, because obviously you had to move the sugar, from one place to another. And a note that I always was very fond of, given that I'm a huge baseball fan, Los Centrales had baseball teams.
Yes.
And there was actually a league or something. And several major leaguers, including Mike Cuellar, Tony Gonzalez, and a couple of others of that generation actually played in some of these baseball teams and eventually were scouted.
Yes.
But yes.
And speaking of railroads, Cuba had a railroad before Spain. It did.
I know. I'm laughing because I'm laughing more out of reality, I guess.
Yes, yeah. But Cuba had it was the British who built the first railroad in Cuba for the whole sugar thing.
I laugh a little bit about Carlos because I remember a story. One of my cousins left Cuba in 1968 and went to Spain, and that was because of our family having my mother having a Spanish father.
Right.
They were able to get to Spain out of Cuba that way. And I remember when he came to the United States, this would be the summer of '68. He lived with us for a while until his family joined him. He was about our age, and we would walk around and go to shopping centers, and we would walk around, and he would say to me, "You're not going to believe how backward Spain is."
Yes.
It would say, I mean, the things that I see here in the United States and the things that I used to remember in Cuba, I mean, it's light years ahead of what Spain was. So Spain was not it was not exactly a country booming with prosperity either, They were really behind the ball in many ways.
Well, they had the Civil War, and then they had 40 years or so of Franco.
Right.
And they were way behind, which is why, through the 1950s, Spanish kept migrating to Cuba.
Right.
And I saw it for myself when I went to visit the family in Spain. in Galicia. In 1980,
Wow.
they still, in some corners of Galicia, had intermittent electrical power,
Wow.
like Cuba is now, right, with blackouts and stuff.
That's right.
In 1980, but boy, after that, it just took off.
It took off, yeah, quite a
And
bit.
when it joined the European Union, wow.
Right.
You know, now they have high-speed trains,
Right.
and the United States doesn't.
That's right. No, it did boom a lot after that. But of course, every time I think of Spaniards and Cuba, I always think of La Tremenda Corte and the Spanish guy in La Tremenda Corte who was always having problems with Tres Patines.
Yes.
And to me, I asked my father one time about that, and he said, you know, that show is not just very funny, but also it reflects what life was like. That you had these Spanish merchants,
right,
you know, on the street. And then you always had el cubanito listo, no, trying to take advantage of them. And my father said that there's a lot to that show. My father would always say that show was really a lot more reflective of Cuban culture than sometimes people think. You know, people just laugh at the show, and I laugh to tears every time I hear it. But there was a lot of Cuba in that show. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Oh, there was. And my brother and I used to listen to it. I think it was on 5 nights a week.
Yeah.
How they came up with the scripts, I don't know. But it was, you know, variations on the same theme.
That's right. And it seemed like, yeah, every time, every show was a different case.
Right.
And they must have had some amazing comedy writers. But my father told me that Leopoldo Fernandez, who I think was Aníbal de Mar was, I think, the judge, and Leopoldo Fernandez was Tres Patines. And my father said that they would improvise a lot. That the Tres Patines had this incredible ability to improvise. So they had a script, but a lot of it was him just saying things that would then drive the show one way or another. Well, Carlos, I want to thank you so much as always. Let's do it more often. I hope we do.
Yes. Yeah.
And thank you so much for your contributions to the Cuban American story, your book, of course, and now your contributions to Babalu. We love them. And if I could put a little plug here for me, just a quick second. I have a post today at Babalu. Today is Richard Nixon's birthday. It would have been his 111th birthday because he passed away in 1994. But it was President Nixon, or at the time Vice President Nixon, who took a look at Fidel Castro and said, you're either a communist or you're very naive. So he was the first one, as I say, who spotted Castro. At least the first one up here, because a lot of people had already spotted him down there. But yeah.
Yeah, my dad on January 1st said, "Este tipo no es bueno."
Right.
This guy's no good.
Yes, and your father turned out to be prophetically right.
Well,
have a great. Go ahead.
My dad knew about Fidel's criminal activities at the university.
Right.
And I think a lot of other Cubans did. So anyway, thank you.
No, my pleasure. It's always a great honor to have you. Great pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us. All right. Good night, Carlos. Our good friend Carlos Eire, professor at Yale. We know him as Professor Carlos at Babalu. He posts a lot of stuff there, and so I want to thank him so much for this wonderful conversation about Cuba. And those of you watching over at Babalu, thank you very much for your support as well. Good night, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.